Hello again, Dan Alasso with History for Today. And this morning I'm going to cover the 10th and 11th chapter of Sönke Ahrens' book, How to Take Smart Notes. This was the fourth of what will probably be 5 installments. So Ahrens begins the 10th chapter on taking reading notes with an epigram from Ben Franklin, who says, "I would advise you to read with a pen in your hand and enter in a little book short hints of what you feel is common or what may be useful, for this will be the best method of imprinting such portcullis in your memory." Ahrens relates this to the whole process of writing, once again, by describing the step-by-step nature of the process. You begin by taking notes, and then you turn them into a continuous draft, and then you revise and rewrite the draft. He seems to me a bit kind of obsessively focused on this draft as the critical element of the process. He keeps coming back to it as if this is the really tough hurdle. I think that this varies from person to person, but maybe, as he says, it's also a matter of preparation. Ahrens also stresses, and I agree, that what we're doing when we take notes on a text is not copying the text content, but having what he calls a meaningful dialogue with the texts that we read. He counters the objection that paraphrasing might change the meaning of what the author was saying with the observation that so does quoting, which takes statements out of their contexts. He seems in this to be depending on the intellectual honesty of his reader. And I agree. It doesn't really make any sense in the long run to misrepresent an author's statement just to shoehorn it into your own interpretation or make it fit your agenda. Ultimately, that is really an admission that you don't value your own opinion if you need to say, "See, this author agrees with me," isn't it? I prefer to say, "This author says that, and here's where I think they're right or they're wrong." And as you'll see, I'll do this with Ahrens several times in the next few minutes. Ahrens says that the complexity and the size of the note that we're going to take will vary, depending both on the complexity of the original text and on our own familiarity with the topic. The focus, once again, is on our own understanding of what we're looking to get from the text. He says that we should take whatever form of literature note that captures your understanding of the text, so that you have something in front of your eyes while you're making the slipbox note. Ahrens suggests that we might want to type our literature notes directly into Zotero, where they will live with the bibliographical information. I disagree. For my own purposes, I like to have the reading summary in Obsidian, where I'm going to make my notes, because that allows me to double bracket keywords as I'm reviewing the reading note, which is often a very useful step for me in the process of determining which ideas I want to elaborate into notes. Ahrens then mentions SQ3R and SQ4R, which are reading comprehension techniques developed all the way back in the 1940s that focus on steps like survey, question, read, recite, review. I think that some of the argument for this type of process has been challenged by research on retrieval practices. And I've even noticed that in recent videos that I've seen on YouTube, Ahrens sort of regrets keeping this in the book. But in any case, I think his point is that we ought to, in his words, treat every text the same, regardless of content. I actually disagree with this. I often go to a text with a particular question in mind. So my task is to find the answer and no more, and then I move on to another text. In other cases, I may want to understand the author's whole argument. When in doubt, if I'm not decided on which approach to take, I suppose it's a good idea to have a fallback strategy. But ideally, I prefer to know what I'm looking for when I begin, if possible. Ahrens also cites a study that suggests that handwritten notes are more useful than typed notes. But this study is based on measurements of how much of a lecture students remembered a week later, depending on whether they handwrote their notes or typed them into a computer. I think this is a somewhat sloppy use of the conclusions contained in the study, which I don't think Ahrens successfully demonstrates also apply to taking reading notes on texts. I'm not even sure, since I'm on the subject, that I accept the study's conclusions for lectures. But maybe I'll talk more about that in a post about retrieval. So, while I sympathize with his aim of encouraging paraphrasing, I think this is a weak argument. In the next section, Ahrens admonishes the reader to keep an open mind and to avoid confirmation bias. He quotes Charles Darwin talking about his practice of noting and trying to answer all criticisms of his ideas. He criticizes the linear process that's taught by most study guides and writing handbooks, saying that deciding on a thesis or a hypothesis at the start tends to, in his words, create a conflict of interest between getting things done, finding support for your preconceived argument, and generating insight. I agree, this can be a danger, but I also think he's sort of overstating the problem. If we've already agreed that the process that we're engaging in, reading and taking notes, is directed at filling our slip box with ideas and data, rather than being just the fact gathering that we're due as we're trying to cram a paper together under a deadline at the end of the semester, then I don't see this as really such a big issue. Ahrens says that we're looking for the gist and distinguishing it from mere supporting details. I think this is akin to what I typically call reading like a grad student when I describe it to my students. And I'll probably do a separate post on that relatively soon. Again, I think that there are often other reasons that we open texts, but if the goal is to process the whole text and understand the author's point and perspective, then this is very useful. And it is, as Ahrens says, for readers and writers, the equivalent of daily practice for piano students. He then introduces a longish quote from Kant. I believe it's from Was ist Aufklärung, his description of the Enlightenment, admonishing us to have the courage to use one's mind without another's guidance. And this is followed by a really long quote from Luhmann, which I haven't run into before. So I'll read it to you in its entirety. Luhmann says, "The problem with reading academic texts seems to be that we need not the short-term memory, but the long-term memory to develop reference points for distinguishing the important things from the less important, the new information from the mere repeated. But it is, of course, impossible to remember everything. That would be rote learning. To put it differently, one has to read extremely selectively and extract widespread and connected references. One has to be able to follow recurrences. But how to learn it if guidance is impossible? Probably the best method is to take notes, not excerpts, but condensed, reformulated accounts of a text. Rewriting what was already written almost automatically trains one to shift attention towards frames, patterns, and categories in the observations, or the conditions/assumptions which enable certain but not other descriptions. It makes sense to always ask the question, what is not meant? What is excluded if a certain claim is made? If someone speaks of human rights, what distinction is made? A distinction towards non-human rights? Human duties? Is it a cultural comparison or one with some historic people who didn't have the concept of human rights, but lived okay together anyway? Often, the text does not give an answer or a clear answer to this question, but then one has to resort to one's own imagination. There are several interesting observations in this that I think go beyond Ahrens' simple suggestion that the better you become in doing this, the quicker you can jot down notes. He says next that Richard Feynman believed he truly understood a topic only when he could give an introductory lecture on it, which I think is a good measure. He also mentions the mere exposure effect, that we equate familiarity with understanding of something. And he cites retrieval research showing that students who simply reread passages from texts performed poorly on tests, suggesting that they were overconfident when they believed they understood the passage, and that this was actually inaccurate. This supports a strategy of returning to our notes to refine them, and maybe even of letting some time pass between visits. The concluding section of this chapter actually addresses several other core ideas of retrieval practice. Ahrens criticizes cramming, and he concludes that elaboration, or thinking about the meaning of what we read, how it could inform different questions and topics, and how it could be combined with other knowledge, is probably the most successful tactic. In the next, the 11th chapter, Ahrens changes course a bit and nearly contradicts himself, actually, when he criticizes students who, he says, tend to adopt the question of a text and the frames of argument and take it as a given. Good readers, he says, can spot the limitations of a particular approach and see what is not mentioned in the text. This is a bit unfair, I think, when just a few pages ago he was advising students to process the whole text and faithfully reproduce the author's perspective. Ahrens seems in this to be trying to distinguish between reading notes, which he was talking about earlier, and permanent notes, which he begins to talk about now, suggesting that you faithfully reproduce the text in your reading notes and then you begin to engage with them critically in your permanent notes. This is okay, I guess, if you have decided to adopt these categories in your note-taking system. Ahrens then moves on to the second brain idea, mentioning that because the human brain is too eager to make us feel good, it frequently overlooks inconsistencies and contradictions that the slip box can help us to identify. Also, since, as he says, we reinvent and rewrite our memory every time we try to retrieve information, the slip box can also function as a more accurate record of our thoughts. Finally, Ahrens agrees with Luhmann that it is not possible to think systematically without writing. Reviewing notes in the slip box also allows us to think about our writing, which is metacognition, and to consider why the things that we wrote down were particularly interesting to us. And of course, observing clusters of notes around particular topics and hot nodes will also further demonstrate our interest more objectively than we might be able to by merely polling our feelings at any given moment. Ahrens then goes off on a bit of a tangent about the neurology of memory, which ultimately brings us back around to a discussion of retrieval practice. The point he wants to make here is about building relevant links so that we have a web of meaningful connections to aid our memory. He suggests that the slip box can help by prompting questions of relevance and similarity and difference and connection. This is a kind of vague description of how to create links, but it does contain some interesting hints. I'll conclude soon with chapters 12 and 13, which are mostly about the writing process. But that has been my synopsis, and those are some of my thoughts about Ahrens' 2 chapters, mainly on taking reading notes and permanent notes. So I hope people found that a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for listening, and I will see you again.